excited because this word was actually, it took some time. It took some time, and that's not a bad thing. And you guys are going to understand after we get into it that waiting is not always a bad thing. It's not. Sometimes the waiting is better than what's on the other side of the waiting. So open your Bible to Psalm chapter 27, verse 14 for me. The waiting is not always bad. In fact, some people before service were waiting for a reaction out of me when I ate some chicken, and they did not get it. Mo day. But anyways, Psalm chapter 27, verse 14, it says, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord." I love the Bible because sometimes it can be so blunt about what it's telling us. It says it twice in this verse. Wait for the Lord. Twice in one verse. I love it. You can't get more real than that. So the question is, what does waiting mean? I feel like we all should know it, but sometimes when you look at the definition of things, you realize that it means something more than what you really thought it meant. So when I looked up the definition of waiting, it said the action of staying where one is or delaying action until a particular time or until something else happens. That's what waiting means. So when it says wait for the Lord, that doesn't mean to just sit there and do nothing. It just says don't take action until something else happens, something that God is working on. So the title of my sermon tonight is In the Waiting. In the waiting. We're going to be talking about what to do while you're waiting. What God is doing while you are waiting. So, a lot of my students know this. Some of the high schoolers might know this if you guys talk to me outside of Legacy. But before I came down here, about September last year, I lived in Orlando. When I lived in Orlando, about, I would say March 2022 is when I felt like God was calling me back down to South Florida, because I grew up down here. So God was calling me back down here. I was praying about it. I was praying about it. I was praying about it. April came, I was praying about it. May came, I was praying about it. Nothing was happening. He said, "I'm going to call you back down to South Florida." And I said, "Okay, when?" So even though he called me in March, I was waiting, I was waiting, I was waiting. Then June came around, and I went and interned at camp, which we're about to go to, and I'm really hyped about camp. You guys hyped about camp? Camp is lit. Camp is lit. Yellow youngins, you know what I mean? But actually, Androff is there right now. So support Androff. But I went to intern at camp for 4 weeks, which Androff is doing 5. He's psychotic. But for 4 weeks I was there, and when I was there, that's when God said, "All right, I'm gonna put you in motion." While I was at camp, my job called me, and they said, "Hey, I have an opportunity for you in Fort Lauderdale. We'll pay you the same. You can just move down there, start immediately, or actually, you can pick your start date, and yeah, you'll be good." So, I obviously accepted it. And meanwhile, I didn't know that I was gonna get this position here at the church. I just knew that I was getting called back down to South Florida. So, from March until September, I didn't know what God was calling me down here to do. I just knew that he was. And I was sitting there waiting with no context. What I'm trying to tell you guys tonight is that even though I was waiting and I was sitting still and I didn't know what was happening, God was still moving. He still has something in store for me, even though I didn't know what it was. Even though I didn't know what he was working at, he still has something in store for me. How many of you guys did fine arts this year? Raise your hands. How many of you guys did a short sermon? Okay, Gabby. Gabby. All right, Gabby, question. When you came to me for advice, did I tell you anything about the pauses that you should take? Yeah? Okay. Does this sound familiar? There is power in the pauses. There is power in the pauses. I think Amy did a short sermon too. Did you not raise your hand? Oh, I didn't see you. I did not see you. I'm sorry. Give it up for Amy. Okay. But, so there is power in the pauses when you're preaching or when you're doing other things, public speaking in general. There is power in the pauses. It gives your congregation or your audience a time to digest what you just said, if it was really good. So I would tell Amy and I would tell Gabby, and I'm pretty sure I even told Joshua because he was doing it at Fun Arts, there is power in the waiting. That doesn't just apply to people on a stage. That doesn't just apply to when you guys are talking to somebody and you said something powerful and you're just like waiting for them to get it. That happens in life. God has powerful pauses. The Sabbath is a powerful pause. God worked for 6 days, and then the seventh, it said he rested. That is a powerful pause. So when you're in a season of a pause or a season of waiting, just know that there is power and meaning of that wait. There is power and meaning of that break that you're getting. If you guys look, I'm not going to read this whole chapter because it's a long chapter, but if you look at Joshua chapter 6, it talks about the Israelites. And some would say, well, the Bible says that they are God's chosen people, right? So God's chosen people, he said, hey, I want you to come all the way over here, like uproot everything, come over here, and I have a land for you that I call the promised land. I want you to go there, and I want you to set up shop. So they went, they followed God's orders, they went to the promised land, and when they got there, they discovered these walls surrounding the land. They were like, yo, God, you just promised us this land, and there's a massive wall surrounding it. How are we supposed to get what you just promised us? There is an obstacle in front of us. Here's what they did. They went, they talked to God. God said, hey, walk around the wall for 6 days, and then on the seventh day, I want you to shout as loud as you can and watch what happens. So they did that. Even though it sounded kind of crazy, they walked, not just like walked and talking, they walked in silence. They said, 6 days. Seventh day, that's what happened. And when they did that on the seventh day, when they screamed, those walls came down. So what I'm getting at is that while you're waiting, because they had to wait to get what God promised them, while you're waiting, there are things that you need to do in the waiting. Thing number one, you have to listen. If they didn't listen to God, they wouldn't have got what he promised them. Number two, you have to worship. That point of screaming on the seventh day, that was worship. They had to be obedient. And they had to be patient. You see, sometimes when we're waiting on the Lord, he's waiting on us. He's waiting on us to listen to him. He's waiting on us to be obedient to what he's telling us to do. You see, these things take discipline, they take determination and willpower, they take strength. And in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31, it says, "But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." These people lasted 6 days, 7 days walking around a wall. They still had strength. They weren't weary. They didn't faint. What this verse is telling us is true. We just read about it, or I just told you about it. There's another story in the Bible. Actually, it's a book in the Bible, but it's only 4 chapters. And it's the book of Ruth. And it talks about how this woman had to wait for her husband. For all the single people in here, this is for you. She had to wait for her husband. You're laughing real hard up here. She had to wait for her husband, like Pierre. So, while she was waiting, there were different things that were going on in her life. God was talking to her through other people, and she was listening. So even though she was waiting, the things that she was doing, she was being obedient, and she was being patient. You see, obedience and patience goes hand in hand. You can't be obedient and not be patient. Because if you're obedient and God says, hey, do this, but it's going to take about 120 years to build the ark, if you don't have the patience, you're not going to be obedient enough to do that. So obedience and patience goes hand in hand. Ruth was obedient and patient. And then God gave her what she was promised, which was a husband. There's many examples of people waiting on God to do what he promised them in the Bible. Some of these examples, Ruth, she waited for her husband. David waited to become king. Joshua waited for the promised land. For some of my leaders or even high schoolers out there, guess what? Joseph waited for a promotion. So all of these people had to wait on the Lord. Look at James chapter 1, verse 22 for me. It says, "Be doers of the world and not hearers only, deceiving yourself." Be doers of the word. Be doers of the word. This isn't saying just read it. This isn't saying just take notes of it and then go back to your life. It says be doers of it. Legacy JV, we just finished a series about what worship really is. And my main point in that whole series was that worship isn't just a song, it's a lifestyle. It's more than us just getting up at this altar and singing our hearts out. No. It's how you act every day in your life. It's how you react to situations that you encounter. It's how you treat other people. That is true worship. So when it says, be doers of the word, it's saying to worship how the word tells you to worship. And not just hearers. And then it says, you're deceiving yourself if you are just a hearer. This is why I love the Bible. I said it's blunt. It doesn't, does it? So obedience to God is the pathway to life that you really want to live. The life you really want to live, the way to get there is by being obedient. So, some of you may say this, because I've been here, and I've experienced this myself. What about when we wait and we listen on God, and it just seems silent? What if we're sitting here praying all the time and we're worshiping, but God has just been quiet? We don't hear a thing from him. We don't see him moving. But I call this spiritual desertion. It's when you feel like God deserted you. It's when you feel like God has forgotten us, left us isolated, and even just like directionless in life. You're just waiting on him. James chapter 4 verse 8 says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Dude, it is so real. It said, cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you two-faced. That's what it said. So if you really feel like God has left you, and you're praying and you're worshiping and you just don't hear anything from God, the Bible is saying draw near to him. You can always get closer to God. Until you are in heaven, you can always get closer to God. Draw near to him, and he will draw near to you. Tune your ears to him, and maybe you'll hear what he's trying to tell you. The only thing harder than waiting on God is wishing that you had waited on God. And I'm not going to be long up here, so I'm going to start my closing. The band can come up. We got a Heat game to watch later, so. You're a terrible human being. So, waiting is an act of faith. That's what waiting is. If you feel like God has left you and God has just forgotten about you and he's just hasn't told you anything, guess what? He might be testing your faith. And I tell you guys this all the time. I literally say it almost every time I preach. Faith is where understanding ends. That's where it starts. So when he tests your faith, you may not understand why he left you quietly, why he hasn't responded to your prayers. That's where faith kicks in. That's where he might be testing your faith. You see, waiting on God is an act of faith, and faith is what separates the men from the boys. It separates the women from the girls. That's what separates them. It's faith. Do you have faith that God is actually working while he's not talking to you? Maybe it's something important and he can't talk to you. Maybe there is something so big that he's about to bless you with that he has stuff in motion that you can't see, that you can't even understand, and you just don't have the faith to let God do his thing. Waiting on God takes strength, not weakness. So when you have faith and you are waiting on God, don't be weak. Don't let others try to talk in your ear and say, hey, why don't you just do this? Let me tell you something. God's not the only one that can place things in front of you. The enemy can too. You're going to need discernment. You're going to need something to be able to understand that that is not what God has in store for me. It might look perfect. It might look like that is exactly what you have been waiting on, but it's not. You need faith. Because when God places it in front of you, he'll confirm it. He will. So, tonight, I don't even want to do like an altar call. I really don't. Instead, I want everybody to spread out and just find their own space. This room is big. It's definitely big enough for all of us. I don't want it bunched up here. You can come up here if you want, but I want everybody to find their own spot. And I want you to listen. Sometimes you just have to be quiet. Sometimes you gotta worship. You have to be obedient. So tonight, I really want us to just spread out. I want us to press in. I want us to worship, and I want us to listen. Because whether you think you're in the waiting or not, God is still always trying to reach you. He always has something in store for you. He might take a second to step back and admire the blessing he gave you, but he's still working on the next one. So tonight, just spread out.